I'm going to give you a bunch of principles here now, which come from Roman Catholic social encyclicals, okay, which began, the very first one, Rerum Novarum, in 1870 by Leo XIII, right up till through John Paul, and actually John Paul wrote some of the strongest social encyclicals we have, to Pope Francis writing Laudate Si, okay. So there's from 1870, you do the math, it's about 130, 40 years and so on. But next thing about it, this is Roman Catholic tradition. So I'm going to be using Roman Catholic documents, and I'll do a footnote on Protestantism here in a second, and so on. And as a teaching, notice, and I'd be negligent if I didn't say this, this is no longer Scripture. See, Scripture is non-negotiable. Scripture binds in faith. If you don't accept Scripture, you're a heretic. Okay. This isn't infallible teaching. This is what we call ordinary magisterium, which means the church said Scripture is not ordinary magisterium. Technically we call that extraordinary magisterium, which means you cannot reject it. If you reject it, you're not a Christian. Ordinary magisterium is not to do with faith, it's to do with conscience. To say, you're supposed to form your conscience around this. Notice that's different. Scripture binds. There's no wiggle room in Scripture. Scripture says, this is it. Here, you have wiggle room, if I can use that metaphor, which means you're supposed to form your conscience around this. You know, to use a Catholic example from some of you, it makes it more clear. For instance, Humanae Vitae is at that level. Humanae Vitae is an infallible teaching. It said, you're asked to form your conscience around this. See, that's the weight of an encyclical. An encyclical is not an infallible document. Encyclicals, you know, they come and you're supposed to form your conscience around them. Okay? Now it's interesting, these are Roman Catholic. There's an interesting history here between us and Protestantism. Like, Protestantism didn't form these principles. And today a lot of Protestant churches and a lot of Protestant leaders, you know, for instance, like Jim Wallace, the great evangelical leader, who's probably the closest thing to Dorothy Day that we have today. Wallace always introduces himself. He says, I'm an evangelical convert to Roman Catholic social teaching. He defines his denomination that way, you know. But it's interesting, while the Protestants didn't have that, they were far ahead of us in social movements. So when you look at the abolition of slavery, for instance, it wasn't Roman Catholicism leading that. Those were the Protestant churches, you know. Or in Canada, where I come from, it was the United Church of Canada and the Protestants who gave us universal Medicare and universal education and so on. And so the Catholics, it's interesting at that point, to go back to last week's thing, Catholics, we were more into charity. You know what we were doing while the Protestants were working at abolition? We were building hospitals and orphanages and soup kitchens. So we were doing the Mother Teresa thing on the street, but we weren't doing the social thing. And the Protestant churches weren't as strong with us in doing the charity thing, and they were doing a lot of the systemic. So they were onto that before we were. So when you look at the abolition of slavery, for instance, in this country, or in Canada, and I grew up to benefit from that, poor kid, education free, go wherever you want, the best schools, medical free, and so on. For a poor person, that's not a bad thing. But we can thank Tommy Douglas, who was a United Church minister who studied at the University of Chicago with Reinhold Niebuhr and got his social conscience there, you know. So the Protestant churches were ahead of us in doing it, but they've never formulated this the way the Roman Catholics have, starting with Leo XIII and so on. And then one last thing to give some history to this. These documents were forged over 150 years, and they're oftentimes reacting to the concrete social situation of the time, you know. So for instance, when Leo XIII wrote Rerum Novarum, the big problem then was what? The big problem then was industrialization in churches, in big cities, and it was the poor were just being plowed under, you know. The world was switching from agriculture to industry, and the poor were in slums. They didn't have any unions. They couldn't feed their families. And so a lot of Rerum Novarum was speaking to that situation. Okay? So it was speaking to unbridled capitalism. But then by the time communism comes along, and some of the later ones, then they're also addressing the other side. So you're going to see a lot of these encyclicals, and I think they have a great balance at the end. They're going to be speaking against unbridled capitalism with no checks on one side, and communism and unbridled socialism on the other side. So they're trying to, because it depends which pope is speaking against which. So Leo the 13th, he speaks very, very strongly against unbridled capitalism and what was happening to the poor in the Industrial Revolution. When they were kids were working in factories at age 7 and so on. Whereas, for instance, some of the later encyclicals are already against communism, and what communism is saying, you don't have any individual rights. So you're going to see that's how these things balance out. Okay? Now, I want to begin with the first principle. And most of us have been raised to believe that we have a right to possess whatever comes to us honestly. It's really true. I grew up like that. I'm sure most of you did. We have a right to possess whatever comes to us honestly, either through our own work or through legitimate inheritance. If your dad left you $1 million, it's yours. Okay? Or you just worked hard and you got it. Okay? No matter how large that wealth might be, it's ours, as long as we didn't cheat anyone along the way in getting it. By and large, this belief has been enshrined in the laws of democratic countries, and we generally believe that it is morally sanctioned by Christianity. I want to ask you, is it or not? You're going to see it's tricky. The answer is yes and no. No and yes. Okay. So here I want to give you a brief summary of the social teaching of the Roman Catholic Church, forged through 150 years, talking to different issues, teaching which has been very much today endorsed by the social justice figures in other Christian churches. So Jim Wallace, Bishop Tutu, William Stringfellow, Ellen Bozak, whom we gave an honorary doctorate to, this is their bread and butter. Okay. Now, what are those principles? Okay. The first one is this, and this is actually taken from Scripture, and that all the encyclicals kind of start with this as their basic principle, social encyclicals. God intended the earth and everything in it for the sake of all human beings. That's a fundamental Judeo-Christian principle. And you're going to see the rest of it shakes out from there. So that, bluntly put, this is not our world. It's not our country. The world is given for all people to be shared. Okay? That has immense implications. Okay? Now how? Okay. Thus in justice, created goods must flow fairly to all, and all rights are subordinate to this principle. So they said, everybody has a right to the goods of this earth, and they're supposed to flow fairly. Okay? Now, it doesn't take a genius to say today, that's not happening. Well, first of all, it's never happened. It's not that we're a bad, horrible generation, Jesus said this is an evil and adulterous generation. I was teaching in the University of Seattle, and the theologian, and we'd meet at tables in the morning. There was a Jesuit from Cleveland. He came down one morning, took his tray, sat at our table, told a joke, and no one laughed. Which I said, well, he says, a humorless generation asks for a sign. He said, and none will be given it. He took his tray and moved on. Okay. It's not that we're an evil generation. No generation has ever honored this principle, except today. Today, the gap between rich and poor is growing exponentially. We're not coming together. We're growing ever, ever further apart. It's true in the United States. It's true in the whole world. So that means fundamentally as Christians, we got to really examine ourselves so that the poor are becoming poorer and the rich are becoming richer. And see if we take the principle like whatever we can accrue is ours, you're going to see that's not fully Christian. It's interesting, to step out of Christian principle And you go into some, for instance, native cultures here in the United States or Canada, they have a thing in native cultures they call potlatch, okay? And potlatch is this. You can only grow so-and-so rich. And then afterwards, you have to start giving stuff away. You have to have potlatch, where you just all of a sudden, the way we have yard sales, except it's not a sale. All of a sudden, you declare potlatch, and you go out and you give furniture away and money away and so on, and you simply rid yourself of a lot of stuff because you have too much, okay? And it's interesting, in their spirituality, it's not so much that the poor need it. You need to do that to stay healthy. The whole idea is you're doing that for yourself. It's interesting. This is a fundamental principle in kind of spirituality, psychology, and that is, we're supposed to give to the poor, scripturally, and so on. We're supposed to give to the poor not just because the poor need it, they do. We need it to stay healthy. So St. Paul says you need to give to others, not because they need it. If you don't do it, you won't be a healthy person. Luke, you can have money, but you better be generous. As soon as you stop your generosity, then it starts becoming a hindrance, a block. It becomes a blindness, and so on. And see, so for the native cultures have this thing of potlatch. So every once in a while you say, well, I have too much. I just have to start giving stuff away. And you're not doing it for the sake that people are getting sick. Otherwise, I'm going to become a different kind of a person. Okay, the church says that too. Now, thirdly, we have a right to and now this would be, see, the first principles, they were spoken more at the time of Leo the 13th, Here, this now is already a statement against Marxism. See, we have a right to private ownership that no one may ever deny this right. See, that's one of the principles of Marxism, that you don't have a right to private property. See, Karl Marx is predicated on you don't have a right, like it's interesting, in the West and democratic, we talk about individual rights, okay? In Marxism, there are no individual rights. There's only collective rights. And there is no such thing as private property. Now, it hasn't stopped people like Putin from becoming billionaires, but they're not supposed to be, It's interesting, I heard a commentary, some Russian writer in New York was on the radio and was saying that the difference between, when we grew up, when you had Khrushchev, for instance, and these older Russian leaders, and he said, what's the difference between them and Putin? And he said, it's this. They believed in the same system, but they themselves were poor. Khrushchev was poor. He was the leader. Today, they're multi-billionaires. And they're saying, well, you don't really have a right to private property. I do, but you don't, and so on. Okay. But see, so this is where you have to protect it from the one side. You have a right to private property. Nobody may deny you that right. He said, but that right is subordinated to the common good, to the fact that all goods are intended for everyone. Now see that the fine line they're walking? You have a right to private property, and that's inalienable. Nobody can take that from you. But at the same time, that right has to be subordinated to the common good. You can't be living off the hog when other people are starving. That you have to take the common good into then. Wealth and possessions must be understood as ours to store it rather than to absolutely possess. And we saw that. That's from the Jewish principle that it mitigates the way we understand ourselves as owners. You own it, but you don't. You're the gardener. It's your garden, but you're gardening it. Okay. Then, this is probably the strongest one of all. And we've never lived it. And even the popes who write that have never lived it. But that is the strongest social justice principle we need to form our conscience by. It says, no person or nation may have surplus if others do not have the basic necessities. That's quite a line, which means until everybody has a pair of shoes, you may not have two pairs of shoes. Until everybody has clothes, you can't have a closet full of clothes. See, so it's saying until you're allowed to have surplus when everybody else has necessities. Now, the popes who wrote that, they have two pairs of shoes. Okay, but it's the principle. This is a flag we have to hang over our heads. We have to try to get there. Religious communities and the vow of poverty, it's predicated on that. and say, like, you can have it, it's not yours, and you shouldn't have surplus, you're going to live comfortably, and but the idea is you got to be giving to the poor. And again, I said, these aren't Christian dogmas. These are principles we're supposed to form our conscience against. See, you're supposed to struggle with this. You're supposed to take that. It's not like, and again, those are ideals. Like I said, in all of these, we've never gotten there. We've never had a world where there were no poor people and the rich and poor shared perfectly. We've never had a world where we did this. We've maybe had it in individual small communities or something. You had it in the early church. Remember the way or the way the Acts of the Apostles describes the first church after Pentecost? They said they all lived in common and they shared everything in common, and because they shared everything, nobody needed anything. See, that worked for about 20 years after Jesus died. Where they lived together and they said everybody would bring their property, they'd put it at the feet of the apostles, their money, and they divided it, and everybody had enough because everybody brought everything they had, and so on. And even there, Scripture scholars says that was probably an idealized text. It probably was never quite that ideal, but that is the ideal. Like I said, these aren't dogmas. These are, I'm holding these flags in the encyclics in front of us. Says, this is where we need to grow to, because that's what's going to happen in heaven. Heaven, everybody's going to have the same. There's going to be no elitism. There's going to be no poor people. So interested, the rich won't have to make an adjustment in heaven. Okay, the poor will have to adjust. Okay, but it'll be a wonderful adjustment. Okay, then number 6. People are obliged to come to the relief of the poor, and if a person is in extreme necessity, he has the rights to take from the riches of others what he needs. The first part, since some of this may sound pretty critical, the first part, just the last 3 weeks here in Texas, I think shows that we're still Christian. The response to I want to say Harvey has been stunning. That's the only way you can put it. See, so when we have to reach out when others don't have the necessities, we showed some real Christianity, and we have to keep showing it, and so on. Incidentally, some commentator said recently, says, isn't it sad that it took a tragedy like Harvey to bring us together? Notice after Harvey, there were no Democrats, there were no Republicans, there were no black, there were no white, there were no rich, there were no poor. It was like Scripture. Everybody was helping everybody, and for a while we bracketed all those differences that are driving us apart, and sadly, oftentimes it takes a tragedy to do that to us, when things are going well, we can't stand each other. Okay. But at least we're good at this, and that's not a small thing. Okay. Then, number 7. The present economic situation in the world must be redressed. See, now again, how and so on. But they're saying today, most of the wealth in the world is owned by 10%. There's millions of people who are refugees, don't have a country, people who are starving. In the United States of America, richest country on earth, 1 out of 5 kids goes to bed hungry at night. To say, this needs to be addressed. We need to address this. We can't just say, well, we're doing well. We're not, Then, the law of supply and demand, free enterprise, competition, the profit motive, and the private ownership of the means of production may not be given completely free rein, okay? They are not absolute rights, but are only good within certain limits. Okay. Let me take the next couple ones which go together with this. Okay. It says, in regards to private ownership in industry, the means of production, in regards to private ownership of industry and the means of production, 2 extremes need to be avoided. Unbridled capitalism on one hand and complete socialism on the other. Okay. And then if you take the 10th principle, I'm going to come back and put the 3 together. It said, governments must respect the principle of subsidiarity and intervene only when necessary. However, when the common good demands it, they may not only step in, they're obliged to step in. You know, in this country, that's an archetypal argument that's been going on since the country's been formed, you know. See, and they're both right. See, there's a lot of people saying when they talk government overreach, well, that's the first principle. That's government overreach, whenever it is, it violates the principle of subsidiarity. See, the principle of subsidiarity, if the lower can do it, the higher shouldn't be interfering. But they said, but then on the other hand, if the lower can't do it, the higher may not just intervene, it has to intervene, you know. Dare I say this is the fundamental argument between Democrats and Republicans in this country, you know. And the right and the left, and notice they're both right. the Pope's saying you have to find a balance in there, you know, that you can't have subsidiarity, has to always be respected, and at the same time, if somebody's getting screwed and somebody isn't getting their share, somebody has to intervene. And see, but that's an archetypal argument. It's true in all countries, you know. Countries just have different ethos, you know, and or if you get in the communist country, there's no subsidiarity at all. It's just all government. But notice that the line the church is trying to walk here. It's trying to walk in between. So we take the principle that you can't have unbridled capitalism, but you can't have unbridled socialism either, you know. So that the answer isn't just what they used to call, a textbook they call laissez-faire capitalism. But laissez-faire capitalism, that's capitalism originally, say during the Industrial Revolution, where there were no checks, you know. So there were no social programs, there was no medical stuff, there was nothing for old people, there was nothing for the poor, there were no food banks and food stamps and so on. And unless the church fed you, you starved, you know. See, it's just, and the whole idea is the rich can do whatever they can do legally. So they call that laissez-faire capitalism. But see, then communism's the opposite. Where communism says there are no individual rights, there is no private ownership, and so on. And the church says it's in between there. It's in between there. You know, the market should be allowed to operate, but if it doesn't operate fairly, it's got to be interfered with. You know, and at the same time, you have individual rights that they can never take away from you. Okay. I didn't say these principles are going to be easy. Okay. Then, number 11. All forms of property must be reserved for the, certain forms of property must be reserved for the state since they carry with them an opportunity of domination too great to be left to private individuals. Now, what's at stake here? I'll give you an issue. See, there are things like, you know, say, electricity, water, where you say that's a basic human right. And if private industry can't assure it, the government has to, because nobody should be able to hold you hostage to have power at your house or to have water at your house. Incidentally, that's a debate going on in this country right now about the internet. See, so companies are saying, you know what? Because companies like making money. They said, we're going to give you two kinds of service, you know. And you already see that this summer I was in Australia. It's already there, you know. You check in a hotel and they said, you have Wi-Fi? Yes. We have the weak Wi-Fi, which you can get for $15 a day. Then we have better Wi-Fi that you can get for $30 a day, you know. And see, so that whereas here in this country up to now, your Congress has said, no, Wi-Fi now is like electricity and water. You can't have people jerking prices around. You can't have that after a while, the rich get an elite service and the poor get a poor service. You know, this is too important. It's to do with education. It's a new form of literacy. You can't be penalizing poor people. But see, companies will do that if you let them. Like I said, I was in Australia. You already have it. You know, any place you go, two kinds of Wi-Fi. buy you know, the Ford Pinto package, or you can buy the Lexus version, you know. And of course, only the rich can afford the Lexus, and so the poor have a crappy internet, you know, unless they have pony up the money and so on. See, your government up to now has said, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. They said, Wi-Fi, it's like electricity, it's like water. We can't have people, playing around with that. See, that's what the principle is here. They say certain forms, certain things are too important. Water, power, heat. Today we'd say, access to information, internet. They're too important that you can't just let the private market regulate that. We're almost at the end here, which will be a relief to you. Okay. Governments may never sacrifice the individual to the collectivity because the individual is prior to civil society and society must be directed towards him or her. Now, notice again, now this is a principle against Marxism, See, so that you're going to see there's a lot of these principles go against capitalism. This one goes against Marxism because Marxism says the society is prior to the individual. Incidentally, that's why with Stalin and so on, why he could kill so many people. Because you don't have individual rights. This is for the good of the group, that you be shot. and so, no, communism at its worst. It's basically, you have no rights, and if it's not for the interest of the group to keep you alive. See, here we say, no, you have individual and inalienable rights, and nobody can take them from you, and so on. Then, number 13. Employers must pay wages which allow the worker to live in a reasonable and frugal comfort. And the wages may not simply be a question of what a contract the worker will accept. But then conversely, workers may not claim that the produce and profits which are not required to repair and replace belong to them. They can't say, well, they're making profits and I'm not getting them. They said, no, you're getting a wage. So they said, and they must negotiate their wages with the common good in mind. As is the case with the employer, it's not a question of what kind of contract can be extracted. It's a very important principle. Now notice this was written initially during the time of Rerum and Varum with the Industrial Revolution, and then more recently in Quadragesimo Anno. But they're saying that, employers, this is a Catholic principle. If you employ somebody, you're supposed to pay them enough that they can live, and this is the technical term they use, reasonable and frugal comfort. Not necessarily luxury, but they got to be able to, basically you say, support a family, live off it. And so it's not, well, it's a buyer's market and I get somebody cheaper. So you can't do that. But then vice versa. Notice they say unions can't extract whatever they can get either. They said both are supposed to have the common good in mind. Say first of all, the employers say, I have to pay people what they can live on, and workers have to say, we can't, if we're in a good bargaining position, get an unfair amount is not good for the common good. Again, they're playing both. You see, it's quite qualified. It's always the common good, what's in the middle. Okay. Then, both workers and employers have an equal duty to be concerned for the common good. So with labor negotiations and so on, it's not just what contract can we arrive at, what is good for not just the company and good for what's good for this country, what's good for the world. And then the condemnation of injustice is part of the ministry of evangelization and is an integral aspect of the church's prophetic role. So, and that was John Paul, who said, preaching this stuff is an integral part of ministry. We got to preach the gospel, we got to preach this stuff. And then lastly, the very last one, Pope Francis said, nature must be respected as having its own intrinsic rights, and human impact on nature and climate must be taken as a moral issue. Okay, pretty clear. That's not quite the same thing as saying there is climate change or there isn't climate change, although Pope Francis believes there is climate change. But what he's saying here is that, see, nature has intrinsic rights. Let me explain what I mean by it. What does intrinsic rights mean? Intrinsic means it's not a right that you accord to it. Like you can give somebody rights. So, we got to respect nature. So for instance, if we saw down too many trees, after a while, then we're going to be breathing too much carbon monoxide. See, we're thinking of ourselves. Okay. Nature has intrinsic rights. Okay. Which means You don't do it because it's good for you, the same as you have to respect other people, you have to respect nature. We call nature Mother Nature. So when you see somebody throwing a Coke can in the ditch, I will say, would you throw it then in your mother's face? It's a strong image. We have to respect nature. You have to respect your mother, so that we can't just do anything with nature that we want, and so on. And the Pope says there's the human impact on nature and the climate must be taken as a moral issue. Like I said, to say, well, that's just a political issue, or it's this, or it's that. I said, no, there's a moral issue here, because nature has rights. Now, when I say rights, I want to ask you this question. As Christians, what's going to happen to the planet Earth at the end of the world? The end of time? What's going to happen to this planet? What does Scripture say is going to happen to our planet? Pardon? No, it's not going to blow up. See, that's the apocalyptic view. And it's also it's not going to be like a stage either. When you go to a play, and you have this exciting play, and then they pull the curtains, and everybody goes, has a drink, and the stage just sits empty, Right. Romans 8:14 and following. Paul says, all of physical creation is longing to be set free from its bondage to decay, to enjoy the glorious liberty of the city of the children of God. So the world is going to go to heaven. We don't know how, because we don't know how we're going either, But all animals and everything, see, and sometimes we don't make that distinction, that Jesus said, I've come to save the world, not just people on the world. Those are two different things. Jesus came and said, I've come to save the world. And by that he meant the people, but also everything on it. When Teilhard de Chardin was called to Rome to answer heresy charges, and Garrigou-Lagrange was actually a pretty good theologian, Dominican. But he said to Teilhard, he was in charge of the Holy Office, says, what are you trying to do? Because nobody understood Teilhard. And Teilhard says, I'm trying to write a Christology that's wide enough to incorporate the full Christ. He said, because Christ wasn't just an anthropological thing. He said, Christ was a cosmic phenomenon. In other words, with that fancy terminology, saying, Jesus didn't just come. He said, I'm trying to give a Christology, an ecclesiology that takes in the world and not just people. Jesus came to save people and to save the planet and the rocks and trees and the animals and everything on it. Quite simplistically put, but accurately. Imagine you have a child or a grandchild and their puppy gets killed or their little kitten, and they're crying and they say, Grandma, will this kitty go to kitty heaven? And you say yes to make the kids feel better. You're actually right. We don't know how. But God assures us nothing's going to be lost. Nothing's going to be lost. See, so the planet Earth is like us. It has a dignity, and it also has a mortality. It's interesting that it also needs an intervention from Christ. Like, the universe is running down. They can predict when it's going to end, They know when it began with the Big Bang, and they know when this Big Bang is finished. So unless there's an intervention, that the planet is also like us. Our planet is dying. The universe is dying, as so are all of we. We're waiting for the resurrection. So it's not just going to happen to us. It happens to the earth, And so today, the last social encyclic we had from Pope Francis said, we have to take nature and how we're impacting nature and so on, we have to take that as a moral issue. It's not to say like whatever we can do. How many trees can we cut down? How much plastic can we produce and so on. So we have to look at these things as moral issues. Now, the moral issue also includes the fact that there are going to be soon 8 billion people living here, and they all have to live. My youngest brother works for Exxon, and he can be quite challenging to talk to. He says, everybody wants to. They said, but nobody stops driving their car. See, well, it's really true. See, we all want some change, but the moral issue also includes that there's 8 billion people living here, and they have to eat, and they're driving cars, and you need heaters, and so on. And so this has to be judiciously if I could say, judiciously adjudicated on how we do this, But yet we always have to have these principles in front of us. Now, I'm going to end where before the coffee break, where I started by saying the principles of the church, these are not dogmas. The stuff from Scripture and Jesus and the prophets, that's dogma. These are conscience formers. The church puts them on and said, we want you to form your conscience in front of them. And like I said, it's probably a horrible analogy I get in trouble for. You have a little more wiggle room. See, with Scripture and dogma, there is no wiggle room. When you say Jesus is God and human, you can't say, well, it's kind of, you're locked in. Okay. They're principles, and say as principles, they're true. And we have to, we struggle to put them practically into life. How do you put them in? How do you incorporate that? How do you live in such a way that you have no surplus? Every one of us in this room tonight has surplus. You have closets and you have stuff that you don't need, and you have to have garage sales and so on. And so, so how do we live that and so on? Or how do we, this last principle, how do we live that we leave the least amount of footprint on this planet, and yet at the same time have to do what we have to do, and so on. So I'm putting them out to you as they're conscience formers, but they're strong teaching. This isn't just like traffic laws. Sometimes when I say teach and say that the difference between what we call extraordinary magisterium, ordinary magisterium, and pastoral teachings, extraordinary magisterium, if you take, like, for instance, we have rules in this country. So, for instance, murder, that's a pretty strong one, okay? See, that's extraordinary, okay? Then you have ordinary. This is like breaking and entering and so on. It's a pretty strong one. See, then pastoral is like your traffic laws and your tax laws and so on. But this isn't a pastoral thing. This is a strong conscience thing, okay? And that's kind of a summary of the Roman Catholic doctrine on it.